We are recording, and can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Good, good. So we're going to talk about Vue. Normally, I would ask people to raise their hand if they've used Vue, but that always gets weird on these virtual talks. Thanks for having me, by the way. I put out a little request for talking engagements since my wife is sick of hearing my voice. I needed some other outlet to hear my own voice. So I appreciate you guys welcoming me. Today we're going to talk about Vue and spas and sort of where I see it all fit. A little bit about me in case you don't know who I am. I'm a Pluralsight author. I do some training on my own website as well. I made a film at helloworldfilm.com if you're interested in a film about us, about software developers. That should be coming out this fall. And let's start talking about Vue. So a lot of us are, the last several years, or maybe even as long as maybe 10 years, have been creating apps with JavaScript for websites. Also, it's been sort of moving into the progressive web applications, and even Microsoft tried their hand at writing, desktop apps using JavaScript. And so what we're going to talk about is sort of this idea of how we're building these. A lot of these are replacements for sort of enterprisey desktop applications, but in the browser. And so there's some different requirements than you would necessarily have on a blog or on something that you were sort of only committing, displaying information for people. And so this moniker came out several years ago that I really hate, called single page application. And I hate the moniker, not the technology, because it implies that we're going to go back to sort of the monolithic, Visual Basic, enterprisey applications. That we're going to have one page that encompasses our entire complex application. And these can be very monolithic. There are times when they're consumer facing, but it's not as typical. And they want to replace web navigation with sort of their own navigation. They want to have routing in the case of something like Angular or React. They also want to sort of centralize those services. And the reason I don't love it is that they typically end up being overused. So spas are great for forms over data, but when we start to see things other than forms over data and dashboards and grids and things like that, I find them being sort of crowbarred into spas, into websites versus web apps. And this is where I think Vue can really present a good opportunity. So Vue has a little bit of a different philosophy than Angular or React or some of the other ones, even Svelte in many ways. And that is, it wants to be simple and minimal. So it wants to do what it does really well, and that's it. It doesn't want to necessarily have Vue be responsible for every sort of thing you want to do on a website. It's built incrementally, so you can scale up as you start incredibly small. As you scale up and add more functionality, you may want to take some of these other facilities that make larger applications work, or even build spas with them, but it's not necessary. Vue is just JavaScript. It isn't necessarily involving Webpack and build cycles and Babel and TypeScript. Like, it doesn't have to, but it can, and I'll show you that in a minute. You can create full spas with it, but often a lot of the interactions we're building are smaller than that. So this doesn't mean that Angular or React are bad. I still use Angular on a number of projects. I never really became a React guy, so it's hard for me to say that I love their approach to everything, but this is about sort of a middle ground between them. So let's talk about how these three sort of frameworks deal with it. So in React, if you've done this before, you know that you have code. It goes through a JSX compiler, maybe Babel, maybe Webpack, but even with this sort of hello world of React, you need to run it through these steps in order to get browser-ready code. And Angular is similar, though the technologies are a little different. They have an AOT compiler and then Webpack to get browser-ready code. And so both of these cases, you need the tool chain as well as the framework. And Vue doesn't do that. You have your code, you have a simple JavaScript file that you can include, and as you scale up, you can go ahead and introduce things like Babel or an ES6 compiler, even a JSX compiler if you're really into that. But these pieces are optional. And so what we're going to see when we look at the code is we're going to actually start by just sort of the old school of dropping a JavaScript file on a page and going with that. The philosophy here is that it wants to do only what it's good at. It wants to get out of the business of doing certain things. So things like networking, instead of having their own HTTP stack, you could use built into the browser, you could use jQueries, you could use Axios, which is a pretty common case. There's a number of validation frameworks, but it doesn't want to be in the business of figuring out how to do validation. It sort of relies on the ecosystem to do that. It does have its own routing, but you don't need to use its routing. But it does have this notion of recommendations. Actually, on the Vue website, there's a way for you to look for certain pieces of functionality, and they'll have curated different packages that it sort of suggests as a beginning point, but it also has a way to look at all the packages that will help you do certain things. So the idea of what it does do, I've talked a lot about what it doesn't want to do, is it wants to do declarative rendering, basically data binding, if you want to think about it in that way. It uses component-based composition, which if you've done Angular or React should be pretty comfortable. One- and two-way binding, has this idea of single file components that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then it has a way to extend itself with plugins, mixins, and filters. Though in the next version of Vue, filters are going away to even more simplify what they're trying to do. The ecosystem is big, and the popularity of Vue is pretty huge right now. It's still behind React because everything is behind React, but it's certainly gaining a huge has a tailwind on it to really encompass a lot of projects. So if you're worried about sort of the future future proofing, Vue's a good way to think about it that way. So enough with slides. I don't know if you're like me, but I don't even like including slides, but I'd like you to sort of have the beginning part before we get started. So let's go over to a demo. I don't have Vue in this project at all yet. This is just an ASP.NET Core project, though it could be any backend. It could be Vue, it could be it could be ASP, it could be web forms even. It doesn't matter how you're generating the server side, but I'm going to use Core in this case. And all this really does, let's go ahead and run it. Because clockwise speeds it up. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but just make sure you only go clockwise. This is a pretty simple website. It just takes, it looks in a simple database I have, and on the server is generating these blocks of code, right? This is just Razor code, and I'll show you it in a minute. It allows someone to go into a bed and breakfast and pick which room they're gonna live with. And so, you know, the code we have here is really simple. I'm not going to dive into the ASP.NET code much, but I do want to just show you that this index page is just as very simple, mostly markup, right? If you've done any server-side code, this should be very familiar. It's just getting information from the server and then generating some markup, which is essentially what Vue will allow us to do, but allows us to do it on the client, so we have a little bit more control over things like validation and user interaction, because these frameworks really come down to the idea of just wanting to create better interaction with the user. And the closer we are to the user, in essence in the browser, we can improve that experience. That's the reason why building these pieces as JavaScript can be pretty useful. And so let's go ahead and re-implement. Let me introduce you to some of the Vue concepts first, and then we'll look at re-implementing this. So I have included Vue already It's in, I'm using NPM to get it, though you can go grab the JavaScript directly from a CDN or copy the file from their website. I'm just doing it in a pretty simple way. And I'm just going to come up here and create something called a section. And if you're not that familiar with ASP.NET, you'll know that a section, I'll just explain that a section is a way to sort of inject code into the page for you. And I just have a section called scripts where it'll throw scripts at the bottom of the page for me. And I'll go ahead and just grab view.min. And because Visual Studio still doesn't know what to do with NPM, I'm just going to need to fix this for a minute. And so we're now including Vue on the page, but we also need our own code. And so let's go up here into AppRoot, and I'm just going to create a index.js, an index file for this particular page. And over here, I'll just also include it on the page. So we're loading Vue, and then we're going to write some code against Vue, right? I like to know what file I'm in, so I always put a little thing there. And the basis of Vue comes with something called a Vue object. So I'm going to create a new Vue object. And this Vue object, I can call something called mount, $mount. And this is going to say, go take control of a certain part of the page. And so over here in the index, before this row, I'm just going to create a new div here. I'm going to give it an ID of the app. And I'm going to have Vue take control of this section of the page for now. Later on, we'll integrate all this. But for now, let's just start really simple. And so mount is going to take a CSS selector for the app, right? And so what do we do now? Vue is taking control of it, but we're not really doing anything with it. What we do in Vue 2 is include an anonymous object, and we're going to go ahead and set some pieces here. And the first one you're going to see is something called data. This is data that you want to expose to the page. And so I'll simply put something like my name, if that makes sense. With this, over where we have taken control in this app, we can just use double curly braces or mustaches if you prefer, and just have access to that element that I created, name. Anyway, didn't case it right. And so this isn't all that magical, but if we go back and look at the code, or the page, I should say, you'll see that my name shows up there, right? Not all that interesting yet. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to surround this with a div so that we can go ahead and just put a button after it. And the idea here is I want to be able to have some functionality here. And the best way to do this is with these attributes that all start with V. So V on is one of the more common ones you'll use. And this says when some event gets fired, in this case, it's going to be the click event, I want you to run some code. I want you to, let's say, on button, right? Whatever you want to call it. I want you to run this code. Now this code is going to live on the Vue object. There's going to be another section of this called methods. And I'm just going to create a function here. And this function will be on button. And then I'll be able to write code. And the this pointer inside the button gives me access to everything in data. So here I'm just going to say name equals this.name plus an underscore, right? Again, this isn't really brilliant business logic, but you can see that what we want to do on the page is allow us, to then interact with the data on the page. And that's an important idea here, is that the markup is going to include the data binding, and that all the code behind is going to allow us to interact with that data. Now, why bother, right? Why bother with all this? One of the use cases I like to talk about is sort of the replacement for jQuery. Because right now, jQuery is really powerful, can do a lot of what we want it to do, but on the face of it, it's really hard to test because jQuery is tied to the DOM object model a lot. Like you're always going and getting elements. And except for this piece where we're just mounting it somewhere on the page, writing tests against this is pretty simple. We can, say if I call on button, name should get longer, right? I can write tests because this is much clearer and much simpler in this kind of the way, excuse me, that I can have more predictable code here. Now, what we've done here is really, super simple. And you might be thinking, but what about when I get sort of bigger? Because, of course, what happens here is as we start to use different parts of functionality, right? This list of scripts is going to get larger and larger and larger, cause more network round trips, deal with caching and all this other stuff. And there is a break-even point where you're like, you know what? I think a build step would actually help me. I would like to be able to sort of build this and be able to build on top of it. And so let me open up a console for a minute. And one of the things that Vue also supports is sort of a way as you mature up is more of a build model like you would see in Angular or React. So you can sort of scale up to this. And it all surrounds this command called Vue. So Vue has a CLI to it that will allow you to do things like build your projects, watch the projects, add extensions to your projects, those sorts of things. Much like .NET and Angular and React all have their own CLIs. There isn't great support in Visual Studio right now for sort of doing a lot of this. You're not going to see Vue as a new project type or any of that. But that shouldn't dissuade you, I think, from using Vue in these cases, because the way it works is pretty simple. I've already actually created a project using the Vue CLI. I've done Vue create, and then I've created a project called Client, which is usually what I call it in Visual Studio. And Client is just a small set of code that builds your project. And so you'll see that it's using its own NPM packages, has some configuration, has some source. And source is where we're going to spend most of our time. This is where the actual guts of how Vue can work. And so let's move from this pretty simple model I have in index.js, and let's introduce and talk about the client. Now, I haven't done much with this client. None of the functionality is written yet. We're going to go ahead and write it. Got a little tickle in my throat. Sorry about that. And so let's start from sort of where, go back to the command line real quick, and let's go into client. And one of the things we can do, because of the package.json actually ends up having different scripts that you can use. And this is part of what it builds for you. One is to serve the project and to be able to test it outside the scope of your back end. So you could even use this to serve your project for release if you're not going to use a back end, for instance, microservices, that might be a case. This will build the project for you. And the one that I've sort of added here is a watch. And what watch will do is if we go ahead and say npm run watch, which is the command to call that script, is it will go ahead and build it, and it's using Webpack underneath the covers to do a lot of this into these two files. And what's important is that these two files are going to be updated anytime I make a change. And so this first compilation took a second, even though there's very little code. But if I would go ahead and, let's say, open up the main and just add a space and save it, before we were able to get back here, it actually compiled. And you'll see the compilation, if I can get that thing to go away, only took 57 milliseconds because it knows what changed and could just put that all together with what's cached. So this gives you a really quick development cycle with Vue. And so let's go ahead and use those on our page here. I'm going to comment these two out. I'll leave them there just so you know that we used them before. And I'm building it into our www root folder under a folder called app. And so I want to first bring up the chunk vendors, and that is the script that just contains all the vendor code. And then it's this app.js, which is the one that's going to contain all of my code, essentially. And you can change the way these are named and where they're put and all of that, but I won't get into that this time. Let's get rid of that. And so we now have that, and it starts with this main.js. So in this case, you'll notice because we're using a build step, we can go ahead and use more of the ECMAScript 2015 or even 2020 as Babel changes with the latest changes. We can use a lot of these techniques that would be harder for the browser. And so essentially what this is building is all your JavaScript into ECMA 5 compliant code that will work in the browser, but you can use these more componentized ways of building your application. So in this case, we're pulling in the Vue library, and then we're going to import this thing called app.vue, which I'll show you in a minute. And so this part of the Vue should look pretty similar, right? We're doing the $ mount just like we did before. We're creating the new view. The only difference here is we're saying, go ahead and render as this entire view, this app component. And so it's starting to think about it in sort of component ways. And this app.vue file is what they call single file components. These are optional. You do not have to use them. At first, I was very reticent about using them. And lately, I've become very comfortable using them. But the idea here is simply that you have a single file that has template, script, and optionally style information. Now, the style information is locally scoped styles for this component. So this is sort of an extension of a way you would add styling that wasn't necessarily in one of your big .css files. And this is doing essentially the same thing. It's going to expose some data, and then you're going to write the code that is going to be injected into the page for you. So if you look at this main, you'll see that we have pound app. And if we remember, we actually called it pound the app, right? Here it's going to be called the app. In this case, I'm just going to comment these out since we don't have those. And let's add another div here and just say, actually, let's do it a different way. Let's first show that this is working by coming back over here. We should see now just say Vue is working, because that's all that component really is doing, right? Ooh, Vue is working. Very, very sexy code so far, right? Just all this work to just spit out a tiny bit of text here. But let's change this a little more. If you remember, we have the rooms here as that data we want to expose, and in this case, the rooms is just an array, and it's a blank array for now. But what we can do is go ahead and create a div here, and we can use another of the attributes here. One is called v4, which will allow us to create one of these for every item. So I'm going to say for r in rooms. So go ahead and create a temporary variable called r that represents a single room, and then repeat this whole section for each of the items in the collection. Now, of course, our collection is empty right now. But I'll go ahead and just use that same old syntax we had before, which is our title, right? So this should just show us any rooms that are available. But of course, right now, there's not going to be anything. Let's actually add a H3 so we know that we've got something there. And over here in the compilation, we're actually going to show that we have an issue. One of the problems is that this template must contain in 2.0 a single element. So we just have to wrap those in a div. So this template needs to return just a single element. So it had a little problem with that, and I forgot about it. So we can now see rooms as being shown, but none of the room values are, because it's an empty array. We want to fix that. Now we could just go ahead and create some rooms here, right? Title, first room. And we can see first room is being spit out there. And in fact, before we go into what is next, let's go ahead and just create a new button here, just to sort of explore how this works. V on, click, just like we did before. And this time we're just going to call add room. And just like we did before, we're going to create a method section that's going to take any methods we want to be exposed to the code. So here we'll say add room. And just like before, we have the this pointer, which has access to this data object. So I can say rooms.push to add a new element and just create a new title equals new room. And in this way, we're telling it to manipulate the number of rooms so that every time we, I probably should put something inside the button. Every time we add a room, you'll see that it's showing up as a new room, right? And so we're able to manipulate the collection. And this is a really central idea here, that we're going to write code here to manipulate the data and then the markup for that data, whether that be in your actual markup file or in a template, is going to react to those changes. At no point here do we have to think about when this re-renders or when this is going to be cycled. It becomes this sort of self-fulfilling idea. So let's get rid of that for a moment, and let's talk about how we would go ahead and get the actual data, because what ultimately I want to do is re-implement this in our Vue object, right? And so we're going to add a new section here. It's actually just a method, and this is how you would add lifecycle events. So on, just mounted is a method to say when this page is mounted, we want to do something. In this case, we want to load some data, right? And mounted is once this page is actually pushed onto the DOM object. So it's a pretty late life cycle. We could also do it on created to happen even earlier before it's actually mounted on the page. But mounted's a good place to do this. And I want to load the data. But of course, the website doesn't know anything about HTTP. We could use the fetch APIs or whatever. But in my world, ordinarily what I would do is actually add it to the dependencies here so that I can use some library that I know about. And in this case, that library, because it's using NPM, I'm just going to say, please install Axios, which is a library for doing HTTP that everyone's happy with. I go clockwise and hope I have a big enough internet connection to download it quickly. Bunch of warnings, but that's life in NPM these days. So now we have Axios added, right? Once we have that, we can just go ahead and here in our script say, just like we would anywhere else, import Axios from Axios. So this is the JavaScript way of importing that library. And then here I can go ahead and use it. Axios.get API rooms. Let's hope that's it. And this is going to return a promise. So I could go ahead and do things like then and then deal with the errors. But because we're being able to write this code in a way that's very compliant to the later versions of JavaScript, I can actually make this even simpler by using async and await. Right? And if you're a C# person, this should be very grateful to have these. So I can just say if result.status equals 200, right? If it actually got the value I wanted, then let's go ahead and say this dot rooms equals result dot data. So the result we get from this call includes all the result header information and such, and then data is the actual payload. And hopefully, if we've done this right, we'll see the varsity and the omni actually show up because we've actually retrieved them from the server, just like the server side had retrieved these from the server as well. So we're actually doing that code. And so let's re-implement what we've done here by just, let's copy the same structure and put this in our, and put this in our template, right? It's the same thing we're doing, except instead of using this @ syntax, I'll come back to source, we're going to use the curly braces instead, right? And because we're being camel cased, I need to change some of the casings on here, but all the field names are the same because I'm getting them from the same place. It's always the point in the demo where I'm like, I hope everyone can hear me. So I'm hoping one of the hosts, if you lose connection, will let me know.
It's all good so far.
Good. And so if I've done this right, let me actually comment it out here, since we're no longer going to care about what the server is doing. We should see something similar to what we saw on the client, unless I've really done something wrong. Oh, okay, so we're getting an error in the rendering because I left in, get rid of that, this @r. And so let's talk about how to change that. Is we could say r dot, and let's change this to the JavaScript equivalent of URL. But in this case, this is different from what we've done here, right? The image is actually, we want to bind to the attribute, not to the content of a element, right? And so the way we do that is actually with vbind : and the name of the attribute. There's actually a shortcut for this, which is just : and so you'll see if it has a colon in front of it, that means we're going to data bind to this expression is going to be used to fill this in every time. If we don't have that colon, we actually just get r dot whatever it is as the source of the URL. It doesn't try to render it. So if we do it right, this seems to happen a lot in this demo where it gets really skinny, but that's a CSS problem that I won't really get into, but we can see we're getting all that same information, right? We have the little book now, we have the description. And so as far as we're concerned, this should all be fine. In fact, we can get rid of one of these levels because we're really saying repeat this item for each one. That may help us solve our problem, but probably not. Oh, good. So this is all happening on the client side. And in fact, I have an extension here, which you'll see Vue Dev Tools, so that in here I can actually look at the running case of the Vue object. I can look at what components are being loaded, what data they have associated with them, how routing if we're using it, Vuex if we're using it, etc. But we're able to really look at, you know, the runtime structure of what's happening in Vue, and so that tooling, like you would have in Angular or whatever, becomes interesting. And so let's talk about another thing, and that is the book now here. One of the places where always stymied me in jQuery, for instance, and in Angular in somewhat, but I think most of these days it's been a lot better, and that is to be able to do something like v-on click. Because in the UI, we have this button that's associated with the template, right? this book now and this book now are different, what we want to do is say on click, I want to do something, and let's just say book room. In this case, I can actually pass in that temporary R variable as the object that I want to book. So I'm having to look at which index I'm in or any of those other weird things that you could do on a click. I'm just going to actually pass the actual whole room. And before I implement that, I just wanted to point out this V on can also be shortened to @click. Just like the :sources binding, @click is event handling. Now, if you're in Razor doing this, you're gonna have to double @ because obviously Razor uses the @ symbol. But because we're in our own file, we can just say @click, and then it'll expect that there's going to be a method called book room. This is going to take as a parameter the room, and we'll, because we don't want to write this whole app right here in front of you, I'm just going to say alert booking room.title, right? Just so you can see that I'm actually getting the room information here. Let's refresh it and say book now, which should say the varsity, book now, let's say the Omni, and then tell me I'm popping up too many messages, but allow us to write the sort of functionality of what we want in a pretty seamless way, right? This becomes very sort of discrete. Let's talk about the sort of component nature, because this app view is considered its own component, right? We might want to break this page up into smaller pieces if we wanted to. Maybe we have the button or whatever. But let's go ahead and create a component, something that we're going to reuse in a bunch of places. And I'll call it, I'll put it in a folder called component, and I'll just call this the weight cursor, for lack of a better name. And you can create it as a Vue file, or you can create it as a JavaScript file. I'm going to do it as a Vue file, just so I have the template here. And I am going to have some code associated with this. I'm going to go ahead and create the script. By the way, this does support TypeScript as well as JavaScript as your script language here. It doesn't have to be JavaScript. I tend to stay in JavaScript a bit longer than some people. And so let's just create a div. And in this div, I'm going to create an alert, which is something from Bootstrap that I'm using, alert.info. And I'll say, please wait, right? So I'll want to show this whenever I'm doing some sort of operation. So back in the app view, I'm doing an operation here in mounted, right? I'd like to be able to show this object in my code. So let's talk about a couple of pieces there. First, we're going to need to import this component because we're going to use it. And there is a way to make them global as well, but most of the time I end up keeping them local. And there's a syntax here which says @ which is the root of your Vue project. And I'm going to say component weight cursor. And then I'm just going to add a new section down here that says components, ones that I'm using on the page are, in this case, it's going to be weight cursor, right? And this could, you would have a number of these if you have more than one. What this allows us to do before we manipulate it with code is actually come up here, let's say before the rooms, and say weight cursor. And what it does is it makes a version of the weight cursor into a composable element that I can just put on the page. So we come back here and refresh, we'll see this weight cursor being shown on the top. There's no functionality to it, it's just sort of plopping it there because all we have in the component is some markup, right? Now I could assume that this was just going to be for display. I can do something like a VIF, and a VIF is another attribute you can use to write some code to say whether to show something or not. And so let's introduce a new piece of data here called isBusy, and I'll say false for now. But down here in the loaded data, let's go ahead and create a try finally. Oh, I'm in the wrong editor for that to work. So if there's an error that we can do it, and we're just going to say this dot is busy equals true, and then when it's all done, make sure that we set this back to false, right? And so the idea here is that we're going to show this when isBusy is true. So because we're on a Zoom call, you're probably not going to see it show up, but just for the second it loads the data, it's actually showing up. And I'll prove that to you by going ahead and actually, let's do this. Let's, I'll cheat and just put in debugger here, just so you can see it show up. So because we haven't actually set it back to true, we'll see that it is showing it. And if we had a real database connection, I mean a real network connection, you'd be able to see this better. But I don't like this because all we're using the component for here is just some simple markup. Oh, good, we have time. And so let's take this wait cursor and make it a little better. We're going to export a default object, just like we did before. But this time we're going to introduce an element called props. And prop are properties to a component. These are ones that can be passed from whomever is using it into us. And so in this case, I could just have created props as an array of just names, but I like there to be more to it. So I'm going to say, I'm going to have a property called busy. And the type will be a Boolean and required equals false. So this is going to say, I'm going to allow someone to specify whether I'm busy, and then this VIF becomes just part of my logic here, because who knows how you want to handle the isBusy, and just say if busy, and in this case, it's going to take busy from the properties that are going to send down to us. So how does this work here? Instead of a VIF, we're going to actually say busy. We're going to bind to busy by using the isBusy. So this is a way to communicate down to the component. In that same way, I'll show you two ways to do this, is we could actually have a message here as well. So let's go ahead and add that other property called message. In that case, when we look at this, the message is going to be spit in there, but we're going to, instead of binding to something, we can just say message equals loading, right? And this isn't bound because this is just some data we want to send down to it. We're not necessarily binding. We could certainly still bind to it, but it allows us to sort of have both characteristics. The last other way that is not uncommon, and let's hope I don't screw this up, is by actually doing something called a slot. So in this case, we don't need a message. What we actually want to do here is to say, instead of a message loading, is to say inside our wait cursor, we're going to say loading data. And whatever we put inside of here ends up in our slot. This is just a placeholder for whatever the data is associated or with whatever's inside of our actual element. And so in this way, we can build these applications that are going to be pretty simple to build, and they're component based, and we can sort of build it out of different objects. You could understand that it would be common to sort of wrap this entire room structure here into its own component that had its own logic. And so you have a lot of small discrete pieces instead of the way I've done it, which is really brute force. Because you can imagine instead of importing Axios, I might instead import some sort of service that then knew how to load the data here. And so as we get larger and larger into these larger applications, it becomes easier to build component-based applications. And then our dependency injection just becomes the way the imports work, right? Because you can just go ahead and get these objects as you need them. And because they're part of the compilation step, as soon as we import them, the dependency management, for the most part, gets handled. So before I take questions, I have one more slide I wanted to talk about. By the way, this demo and the slides will be available on my website later today or tomorrow, so you will be able to get them all. Vue 3 is being developed right now. It's actually in beta. And one of the strong things about Vue 3 that I think is important for you to know is that Vue 2 isn't going away. It isn't an Angular to Angular 2 sort of situation. All the syntax in 2, for the most part, is going to be available in 3, and they're going to continue supporting version 2, so you don't have to upgrade if you don't want to. It does some things to mature the library, to expand some different ways, different options for the way you're creating your applications. It steals / borrows some interesting ideas from React, and has some major feature changes. The composition API, which is a new way of composing your components that I won't have time to cover in this talk, moves away from global objects. You'll notice that there were a lot of like new Vue was a global object, and brings in much better TypeScript support and fewer magic properties that are on the are on every object. So it really is I've been using it on some demo projects, and I'm pretty happy with the way Vue 3 works. But it is still, they're releasing 2 or 3 betas a week, and so it's breaking a lot of things right now. Not quite the right time to get into Vue 3, but you should just be aware of it if you do decide to take a look at Vue. So let's go to the comments and see if we can find any questions.
Ironically, there are none.
Wow.
And that's fair. What we'll do is I'll unmute everybody. Don't all speak at the same time, please. And then, that way, hopefully, if there are any questions, we can go from there.
Great.
Cool. Everybody's unmuted. Basically, yeah, there you go.
Any questions? Don't be shy.
Hi, Shawn. Thank you for that. So, is it much closer to Knockout was than sort of the big, heavier Angular side of things?
Well, to me, it can be as simple as Knockout, or it can be as complex as Angular. It sort of fits in this middle space where you can scale it up to the complexity that your application needs. I like this because often I will prototype what we need in Vue just using the drop the library and go method. And then once we realize that we're going to need it in a much bigger way, or a much more important way, we may just opt into doing the full build strategy. Whereas in React or Vue, React or Angular, for you to just prototype an idea, you really have to buy into the entire build cycle from day one. And that's where I think it really fits into this, because I sort of talked about this earlier, this idea of single page applications being problematic, because I think what we're really wanting to build are sort of islands of functionality on multiple pages. Now, some of them might be large and monolithic, but the idea that you're going to build your website and then have something like the contact page or the about page as just another navigation to a different part of your Angular app makes me a little crazy, because there's no need for those to be not their own thing. The other thing that Vue does really well, as opposed to some of these others, is it allows you to build more than one page using their build system. And so the idea that you might build 6 or 7 or 3 or 4 of these smaller packages that you're going to use on different screens from one code base instead of having 7 projects for 7 different things. In this case, being able to share all that code becomes pretty useful for me. So I think it works more like the way I do, which is I like to start small and then as I scale up, use things more and more. And I never felt that way about Angular, where I sort of had to opt into everything at once.
Thank you.
Hi, Shawn, what's the best way to deploy Vue to Azure?
Well, it's just JavaScript at the end of the day,
Yeah.
so there's no magic about it.
So just try using the try using that deployment. I forgot what it's called. That's like a Vue service that generates the project for you, and I try to upload that to Azure kind of app service, and it generated all the output for it, but then it didn't publish the website. I couldn't quite get that working. I'm not sure there's a
That's interesting. If you were using it without like a backend framework like ASP.NET, you could just deploy it because it again is just markup and JavaScript. You know, I've got a number of these up there that I just deployed, but part of my build script was to run the build, right? To actually generate them. So the CLI in the case, like there's an example up there of on GitHub under Shawn Wildermuth, my name on GitHub, and then it's Core Code Camp. It actually uses views to do some of its functionality for admin, and so you can see maybe some of the ways by looking at the CS project file of how I'm handling that. If you want some examples.
Great, thank you. Cheers.
Sure.
So we actually have we have a couple questions that are on the chat, which I think this first one actually kind of leads with what David was just asking. Is there a way to output the Vue components through server rendering if JS is disabled?
There is. There is a server rendering system in there that you can use. You can use the middleware in the Node middleware that the same way that Angular and React do their server-side rendering. I haven't touched it because I've never really figured out why the server-side rendering was important for what we were doing. So I can't really speak to exactly how well it works or any of that because I just haven't done it. But they do have a server rendering piece for Vue for 2 and 3. So another question here is, what do you have to do to enable syntax support in Visual Studio? So there's a plugin for Visual Studio that's part of the MADS web extensions pack, and they that extends support for it. In Visual Studio Code, the package or the extension is called Vuetex, V-U-E-T-E-X, I believe. I may have that exactly wrong, but what's interesting, since I still have the screen, let me show you what I normally do, because I don't find Visual Studio that interesting to, or that useful for developing in JavaScript in general, is I have a little extensions here that just lets me open up and code, and I'll normally actually do my development here in Visual Studio Code. So in here, I don't have to open a console. I can tell it to go ahead and run the watch for me. And here I'll get pretty good IntelliSense for Vue. So import. Oh, my favorite thing, which I wish Visual Studio would do, is if I were to use. This is a bad place to do it. Let's do it in the other component. So let's say I decided I needed to create an Axios element. Let x equal Axios. You'll notice it shows it here, and if I press enter, it'll actually go ahead and grab the import for me because it knows about what's in there. So I really dig the Visual Studio support the Visual Studio Code support for Vue. If we look at my extensions, I think this way we'll at least know what the real name is. Not recommended, enabled. Get away. Oh, I'm not even using Vuetex. I'm just using the Vue one. But there are a few that support Vue. Oh, there it is, Viter. Not Vuetex, Viter. That's the one I use. That does most of the heavy lifting for me. Let's go back to the chat, see if there's any more. Someone mentioned that VS Code has good integration with Azure as well, which it certainly does, and for Docker if you're doing that as well. Any other questions?
First off, thanks for showing adding it to an existing site. That was like a total epiphany for me, because that's often the bit you don't see on like intro things. So really appreciate that. And looking at their site and stuff, they've got like a Redux style state management thing. Have you tried that? Is that any good? Is that worth looking at? Or?
I really like it. I find it much simpler than Redux. Sometimes it's a little overkill, but if you're dealing with any decent sized project, Vuex, which is what it's called, I find really very straightforward to work with. Whereas in my little experience with Redux, I found it overly complicated. And so I use it in a lot of the big projects. You'll see. Actually, let me go to the slides with the links, and I'm going to actually add a second link here, so you can see an actual one that's working. GitHub.Shawn Wildermuth. Let's see if I can type my own name without having to see it. Oh, that was wrong. Maybe we can get some people to help me figure out how Windows works. Core Code Camp is one where I've do it that way so you can still can't see it. Is a project that is where I've done some development on Vue, and you can see some decent non-trivial examples of how we're using it. And this is something that's deployed up to Azure, so I know that the Azure part works as well. Though I'm moving in Azure, I'm moving a lot more to using Docker containers to be in app services than I am deploying directly to Azure, just because it's a little more repeatable. I love being able to find out in the client that I have a case naming issue that bites me when I get to the server. That has caused me more pain than anything in that if I'm deploying to a Linux box up in the cloud someplace, that case sensitivity in Linux versus non-case sensitivity in Windows is the thing that almost always bites me.
We've got another question in the chat from Richard saying, how do you handle asynchronous return from a web call service? And I guess that's in the context of Vuex, whatever it's called.
In the same way, but because I can do async and await, this is essentially an asynchronous call from a web service, right? This is what that is. And so I'm using async and await as features in the JavaScript language to handle that for me. I don't have to use them. Instead, I could have done because these are just JavaScript promises, I could have done a then result, and then had some callback for that, and then catch for errors. You know, I could use that syntax as well, but with because I can use async and await, this code becomes a lot more trivial, where I can just use try catches instead of the catch call, and I can use just the result here, and this this code will become, when rendered, it'll become asynchronous, just like in C#. Which testing technologies do you recommend? There's really two that work well with Vue, and Jasmine is the one I most normally use, though I'm certainly not one that tests his JavaScript code well enough to be a proponent of any of the libraries, but Jasmine is the one I've used most. It's the one we're using on another demo project with for a microservice example we're doing up on GitHub as well. That's at Shawn Wildermuth / Ticket Scalper, if you're interested in that. In that one, we're doing all Vue 3, and so you'll be able to see some examples of how Vue 3 differs if you're curious. Oops, we're almost there. And so any other questions while I just show the links to where to get Vue, and the demo and the slides will be up on my blog, like I said, later today or tomorrow.
Looks like we had another one from Jeremy. Do you have a Vue? I don't know if that was a deliberate pun. on whether it's better that Vue isn't owned or run by a big tech company like React and Angular?
Well, I do have an opinion about it. It really comes down to risk, right? There's the thing that Facebook owning React and Google owning Angular means that you're sort of bringing in the reliability of a big company that's not going to go under one day or abandon their project. And Vue is certainly much more community driven. There's one fellow, Evan Yu, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's doing a lot of the work, but a lot of it's community oriented. And so there is the fear of what if he gets, a job or, but he's done a good job of getting sponsors and doing other ways to support him so that he doesn't have to worry about that part. So he can really focus on doing the thing he's passionate about. He actually used to work for Google. He was a client of the Angular team. He wasn't on the Angular team. And that's where sort of a lot of these ideas came from.
I was asking because I was thinking that sometimes there's always the argument, say Google owning Angular or Google's big, it's not going anywhere. But on the other hand, Google has a fabulous history of developing products for people. Loads of people become entirely dependent and run their entire business on a product, and then literally overnight they'll decide, no, we're shutting that down and it's gone, and your entire business has disappeared. They do that frequently, so it's quite good, in my view, that it's a real open source community project.
Yeah, but that's absolutely true. But you also get some of the same benefits from React and especially Angular, because they're also being developed as open source projects. They're not not closed source in any way. So the community could take up, if Google fired their whole Angular team tomorrow, Angular wouldn't stop working or being developed, right? So it really does come down to the kind of risks that your company wants to take. Some people, some organizations, some CTOs, frankly, don't want to rely on anything that's not from a big company. And some have your view, which I think is just as valid, of we don't want to be beholden to big companies. We don't want to have to rely on them for our company, what we're based on. And so open source is better. So I don't think I got the joke.
Yeah, we've got some background noise. I'll see if I can mute them.
No worries. Other questions?
I think we got them.
There you go. Oh, there's some more chats.
What kind of projects where you think Angular and React is a better option?
It's an interesting point. I'm not a big fan of the way React works, and so I haven't hopped on that train, so it's hard for me to say. React feels like it was built by Facebook for Facebook in some ways, because Facebook's websites are very component-based. Like instead of it being one sort of website, each little piece of Facebook does a very specific thing, and so React makes a lot of sense there. Angular, I suggest in some cases, just because there are organizations and skill sets that are used to everything being in the box. The idea of having an option of how you do validation or how you do this isn't attractive to them. They want to go, in many ways, Microsoft developers are like this. We're used to the .NET framework being a really complete thing that we then add some things on if we need them, but we expect 90% of what we need to be in the box. And that's kind of what you get from Angular, is you get everything sort of, even though it's not included in the same project, it's all coming from really one set of developers. Certainly with there are options out there, just like there are options with .NET. So to me, it's more of a cultural difference. Angular works really well with truly monolithic applications. It's really what it was built, was built to do things like Gmail and Google Maps. Most of us don't build that. Most of us build much smaller sort of pieces, and the weight that comes with Angular to allow these larger applications to work really well, I think sometimes gets in the way. It's also a stylistic choice. Like being able to not necessarily rely on attributes and complex attributes or what decorators, I guess they're called in TypeScript and JavaScript. I don't tend to like that style of development, and so the sort of everything's a class in Angular sort of gets under my skin a little bit as well. So if you're building sort of if you're replacing your VB application with an Angular application, Angular does that really well. But I think Vue could do it just as well. It requires, I think, you to understand how JavaScript works a little better, and being willing to sort of embrace open source a little bit more than Angular does.
Cool.
Thanks, David.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, I had a question with respect
Sure.
to Blazor and how that fits in, because that seems like a landscape changer as well.
It can be. I'm about to actually record a video about my views on Blazor since I get asked so often. I don't think Blazor is for me. What I mean by that is Blazor feels like it is for organizations and companies that just refuse to understand or learn JavaScript. So I often say that Blazor feels like it is for web forms developers, like people who never really embraced client-side development in any sort of rich way, and that want complex designers. And my big issue with Blazor right now is just the startup speeds for Blazor ASMX are just awful, because we're essentially compiling the entire a version of the .NET framework in WebASM and then needing to load it to run the app. I'm sure they'll improve that, and maybe one day I'll be wrong. I don't get it as something that is better than what we're already doing. It's doing a lot of the things that are sort of under the covers, its use of SignalR to do some of the magic of the way the website stuff works. Just feels like sort of what we were thinking about in sort of the Silverlight space and the ActiveX space before then. So Rob had mentioned that WASM is much more about containerization. I actually think WASM is really important in changing the way web development is going to happen, because tool vendors can take advantage of it. So imagine, instead of having these giant, maybe even slow versions of the components that you use, but I don't think everyday developers necessarily need to go to WASM, because ultimately WASM has to be linked up through JavaScript anyway to really get at most of these pieces. And maybe it'll change, but certainly I think that there's a place for Blazor, and I just don't think it's going to replace Angular or Vue or React or Svelte or any of those guys. It's a different beast for a different audience. But I'm wrong. I've been wrong before. I've tied my ship to many a technology that died on the vine. So do your own investigation. Start a Blazor project, play around with it, see what you think about it. It might be perfect for the kind of organization you're in, or the type of skill set you're in, or maybe the startup speed isn't as important to you because of the nature of the way you're building larger monolithic applications. So I don't want to dissuade anyone from looking at it. Really look at it for yourself. I don't see the use case for the kind of things I do. I'm so used to writing JavaScript on the client that it's not a big deal for me. But if my organization had been always adverse of writing client-side code, it might be a good fit for you.
Cool, thank you.
Brilliant. Let's call it there then. Thank you very much, Shawn, for taking the time to give this talk. It's been really great. Everybody join me in a virtual round of applause. Unfortunately, Zoom kind of disables the audio, so use the clap functionality. I'll give a sudden clap.
Thanks.
It was really good. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the prize draw now. Unfortunately, Jason's internet's cut out, so he sends his apologies. But yeah, let me share my screen and we'll give we'll do the prize draw now.
Great. And I'm going to drop off if you guys don't mind. I have another talk to be on.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Shawn.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks.